Greetings, this is Pastor Tim Craven from Mellinger's Lutheran Church, and this is the next part of my series on what you need to know to be a Christian disciple. Today's message is on the Holy Sacraments and worship. And this is a glass of wine. People have been drinking wine for thousands of years, and it's very interesting to note that the Christian church uses ordinary elements as their sacraments: wine, water, and bread instead of gold and silver. The Catholic Church has 7 sacraments, and including matrimony and holy orders, and the Lutheran Church only has 2 sacraments. We have baptism and communion, and we only have 2 because these are 2 that Jesus directly told us to do. The others are holy, but we don't consider them sacraments, but they're holy nonetheless. But we believe that the 2 sacraments are Holy Baptism and Holy Communion, or the Eucharist. Eucharist is a Greek word meaning thanksgiving. And a sacrament combines an ordinary element like wine or water or bread, which is in a sense symbolic of the incarnation, how our God became an ordinary person. He was divine also, but he was also a human being. So a sacrament contains an ordinary element and a promise. And the promise of baptism is salvation. And the promise of the Eucharist is forgiveness and spiritual nourishment. Now, in the Lutheran Church, we baptize babies. And some people say, well, why do you baptize babies? They can't make up their own mind about what they're doing. And this is true. But however, Jesus in the Gospels says that, he says, let the children come to me. And he says, unless you adults become more like these children and have the faith of these children, you won't get into heaven. He doesn't say, wait till you kids are as smart as these adults. He accepts the children and he blesses them. Now, Jesus never really baptizes anybody. Interestingly, John the Baptizer baptizes Jesus. And Jesus comes and then it tells the disciples when he leaves at the end of Matthew, before he ascends to heaven, go and baptize everybody and teach them what I have taught you. But we baptize babies because essentially baptism is not about our decision for God. Rather, it is about God's decision for us. It's important for us to make these decisions as we grow older, and until the baby is older, the baby has the faith of the parents. When a baby is born, we don't wait until the baby is old enough to decide what they want to be called. We name the baby and make the baby a part of the family right away. The baby, of course, can't vote in budget matters and things like that, but the baby is a full member of the family. And this is too is what happens in the sacrament of Holy Baptism, where God's gift of salvation comes to us. It's always important to remember that no matter how significant our decisions are, that the decisions of God precede our decisions, that God chooses us, as it says in John, not that you chose me, but that I chose you. And so not to minimize our instruction or our own decision, but to keep it in perspective, that baptism is about God's decision for you, not about your decision for God. In the Holy Communion, we see Jesus in the last week of his life. He changes the Passover meal to be about what he is doing and talks about his blood and his body as being the wine and the bread. Interestingly, in the Catholic Church, they believe in transubstantiation, where they believe that the elements are actually become Christ, that's blood and body. In the Lutheran Church, we believe in something we call real presence. We believe the wine and bread stay wine and bread, but that the Holy Spirit is in them, so that God is actually there. And then many other churches believe that it's a memorial meal in remembrance. Actually, theologically, to theologians, sometimes this is important, but I think it's kind of almost a semantic argument. I think all Christians believe that Christ is present when we share Holy Communion. So we drink the wine and we eat the bread, which Jesus says is his blood and body as he saved us. The age of communion varies. It used to be older. You used to have to wait till you were like 15 to have communion, but the age has lowered in recent years as we keep it more consistent with our baptism theology. At Mellinger's, we leave it up to the parents, but any child at any age can receive the sacrament if the parents agree to this. And once again, it's because it is the work of God, the gift of the bread. And sometimes, we think children can receive a gift better than adults can anyway. And how often must we have communion? For many years, there was an argument. The Catholic Church has communion all the time, and so the Lutherans in America, and I grew up Presbyterian, we only had communion about 4 times a year, and they say, we don't want to have communion too often, that's too Catholic. Also, people believe incorrectly about the sacrament as though it's some sort of law or punishment. Like, I just had it last week, why do I need it this week? I got my driver's license last week, why do I need to get it again this week? Communion is not a law. Communion is a gift. The old bulletin inserts we had were called celebrate. So we want to have communion. Luther had communion 5-7 times a day. He said it was like oxygen. You need it all the time. And this argument about the Catholic Church, in the Lutheran Church, it seems like Lutherans and Catholics have been arguing since they started, since the Lutheran Church started. But it's less today than it used to be. But still, you hear this, so I don't want to have communion all the time. Having communion all the time was not a invention of the Roman Catholic Church. Having communion all the time is something the early church did, the earliest Christians, before the Roman Catholic Church even existed. Every time they got together, say they got together in a house, when Christianity was illegal, they had a fish sign on front in the dirt so that people would know that the Christians were meeting there, and they would tell the story, which is what we call the readings or preaching today, and they would share the meal. And by the way, too, it was probably women who were the first presiders at the Eucharist, because they were probably serving the wine and the bread, which they did every time they met, because Jesus told them to do this. So having communion is not a Roman Catholic creation. Having communion all the time is a part of worship, the way worship was designed from the very beginning. Also, speaking of worship, there are many ways to worship, and this is another sort of hot topic today, that people go into a liturgical church and people do the same thing all the time in the same way, and they say, well, aren't they creative? Are they so bored they have to do the same thing all the time? And so I'd rather go to a church, where they jump up and down and make a lot of noise and get really into it. Well, there are several ways to worship, and we're very lucky to be in the United States where we have freedom of worship, so we can pick. Now, if you go to a church where you are, really involved and jumping up and down and everything, that's wonderful. And then you could say, how is this changing me? How is the message changing me? How's the music moving me? How am I connected in the Spirit in that way? And that's great. But people don't understand, I think, the liturgy and why it is a good thing. The liturgy is a way to get us out of ourselves. In other words, another question we can ask when we go to worship is not how we can get something out of this, or how can I think about myself in this, but a question we can ask is, how can I stop thinking about myself for an hour? How can I think only about God? And so the liturgy is used to empty our thoughts and our feelings so that we draw closer to God. And I'll share with you an example of how I really learned this. It really meant something to me. I went to a Catholic monastery in Lancaster one time. I went into the chapel, and they had the votive candles there all around lit, and the place was pretty dark, and I couldn't see anybody in the chancel, but I could hear the nuns praying, and they're praying the rosary, and they're praying the Lord's Prayer, and it was a rote sound. It was like this over and over again. And I thought, man, they can't possibly be understanding the meaning of what they're saying. Why are they doing this? And then, friends, let me tell you, I figured it out because I stayed there for a while. And after I stayed there for a while, I realized what they were doing. They were emptying their minds and their feelings so that God can enter. In other words, they were intentionally saying this rote thing over and over again to get themselves empty inside so that they could be in touch with the Spirit. So this is a great thing about the liturgies. If you wonder why people do this all the time. Some of the prayers that we pray, prayer of the day, are like 15 centuries old, and it connects us to Christians before. But there's no right or wrong way to worship God. And I think that we all could benefit from attending worship services other than our own, so that we can learn not to criticize the other, but we can learn things from the other. There used to be a pulpit exchange among the Cocalico Ministerium, and I was preaching at an evangelical church in Reamstown one time, and they were all jumping up and down and hooting and hollering, It was a little frightening, actually, and they were having a great time, but they never had any Good Friday services. They never had, like, the theology of the cross. So I told them, I said, you guys ought to come to Mellinger's on Good Friday, and the people from Mellinger's ought to come over here on Easter. Because you guys truly understand this joy, and we understand the cross. So we can learn from each other. We can learn from each other as we go along. So the Holy Sacraments are very important in our life as Christians, and so is worship. And so that's just something that you need to know. So God bless you, and the next time you have communion, remember, this is an ordinary element as Jesus became a human being just like us. God bless you.